The storm had been building for hours before Josiah Cole first heard the screaming, a sound so out of place in the high country that he nearly convinced himself it was a mountain lion before some older instinct told him otherwise. Some part of him that had spent 11 years alone in these peaks and had learned to trust the difference between the wild and the human. He followed the sound down through stands of quaking aspen already turning gold with the first breath of autumn, his rifle loose in his hand. His long strides eating the distance faster than a man his size should have been able to move through such broken terrain, and what he found at the bottom of a ravine stopped him cold in a way little else had in years. A young woman lay half-tangled in the wreckage of what had once been a wagon. Her clothing strange and glittering, even torn and filthy as it was, dark red fabric sewn with sequins that caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds, the kind of costume he had only ever seen once before, years ago, in a traveling show that had passed through a mining town before his life had gone the direction it had gone. She was conscious, barely, her face streaked with tears and dirt. A nasty gash opened along her upper arm where she had been thrown against rock. And when she saw him approaching, a wild-haired giant of a man emerging from the tree line with a rifle in hand, she flinched back so violently that she cried out in pain all over again. He raised his hand slow, the way he might approach a spooked horse, and told her in a voice gone rusty from disuse that he meant her no harm, that he had heard her calling out and come to help, and something in his tone, or perhaps simply the absence of any other choice, made her still enough to let him near. Her name, she told him through chattering teeth as he worked to bind the wound on her arm with strips torn from his own shirt, was Lily Hart, and she had run from a traveling circus 2 days prior, fleeing on foot into wilderness she did not understand and had no business entering alone, driven by a desperation she did not yet explain. The wagon she'd been sheltering beneath had been an abandoned prospector's cart, its wheel giving way in the storm and pinning her leg beneath it before she managed to work herself free, and she had been screaming for the better part of an hour with no real hope that anyone would hear her this deep in the range. Josiah carried her back to his cabin himself, refusing her weak protests that she could walk, because one look at the swelling in her ankle told him otherwise, and the storm was closing in fast enough that there was no time to argue the point. His cabin sat in a high mountain hollow, a single room built solid against the winters, a stone hearth, a loft for sleeping, shelves lined with a meager but carefully tended supplies of a man who had learned to survive on his own terms. He set her by the fire, tended her wounds properly this time with what herbs and clean cloth he had, and though she watched him with wary eyes throughout, flinching whenever he moved too quickly, she did not run, mostly because she could not, her ankles swollen thick and her body exhausted past the point of further flight. He did not press her for her story that first night, understanding instinctively that trust was not a thing to be demanded but earned, and instead simply fed her from the pot of venison stew simmering over the fire, gave her his own bedroll near the hearth while he took the floor by the door, and let the silence between them stretch without forcing it to hold more than either of them could bear. It was 2 days before she spoke of why she had run, and even then the words came slow and halting, pulled from her like splinters worked loose one at a time. The circus, she explained, had not been the glittering world of wonder it appeared to outsiders. Not for her. She had joined at 15 after her parents died of fever, taken in by a ringmaster who called himself her guardian but treated her as property, training her as an aerialist and contortionist because her small frame and natural grace made her valuable. And for years she had told herself the bruises and the exhaustion and the cold nights sleeping in wagon beds were simply the price of having somewhere to belong. But the ringmaster's demands had grown crueler as she'd gotten older, his temper sharper, his hands harder when a performance did not please him, and 2 weeks before Josiah found her, he had struck her hard enough to leave a mark that would not fade for a fortnight, and something in her had finally broken free of whatever had kept her tethered to that life. She had waited for her chance and taken it during a supply stop in the mountains, slipping away in the night with nothing but the costume on her back and a small bundle of coins she had hidden away over the years, running with no plan beyond simply putting distance between herself and the only life she had known since childhood. Josiah listened to all of this without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands curled into fists he kept carefully out of her sight, because he understood cruelty in a way that went beyond sympathy, understood the particular violence of being owned by someone who called it care. He did not tell her his own story that night, not yet, but something in the way he listened, the way his silence carried weight instead of judgment, told her that he understood more than most men would have, and that understanding became the first thread of the fragile trust that grew between them in the weeks that followed. She could not travel far on her injured ankle, and the nearest town was 3 days' hard ride even for a man who knew the trails, days that would only grow more dangerous as the weather turned. So Josiah offered, gruffly and without elaboration, that she was welcome to stay through the worst of the season, that his cabin was small but the roof did not leak and there was food enough for two if they were careful. She accepted, mostly because she had no better option. But as the days passed into weeks, that reluctant necessity softened into something else entirely, something neither of them named at first, but both of them felt growing in the quiet hours they spent together, mending clothes, tending the small garden plot he kept behind the cabin, hauling wood, learning the rhythms of a life so different from the one she'd fled that it felt at times like stepping into another world entirely. She learned that Josiah had not always lived alone in the mountains, that he had once had a wife and a young son, that a fever had taken them both one terrible winter years before and left him unable to bear the sight of the town they'd shared, the house full of their absence, and so he had retreated into the wilderness where grief could not find him quite so easily, where the mountains asked nothing of him but survival and gave nothing back but silence, which had seemed, for a long time, like a fair trade for a man who had nothing left to offer the world. Lily found herself drawn to that grief in a way she had not expected, recognizing in it a kinship with her own losses, and she began, without quite meaning to, filling the silence of his cabin with small things, humming old circus tunes while she worked, teaching him simple balancing tricks she'd learned as a girl that made him laugh, a rusty, unfamiliar sound that seemed to startle him as much as it startled her. He, in turn, began teaching her the skills of the mountains, how to track game, how to read weather in the shape of clouds gathering over the peaks, how to set snares and skin a rabbit and keep a fire burning through the coldest nights, and she proved a quicker study than he expected, her performer's discipline translating easily into the discipline the wilderness demanded. There was a particular afternoon in October, the aspens blazing gold across the hillsides, when he took her up to a ridge overlooking the whole valley, wanting to show her the view before the snows came and made such climbs impossible, and standing there together with the wind moving through her hair and the vast, humbling sweep of mountains stretching in every direction. She told him, quietly, that she could not remember the last time she had felt safe, truly safe, without the fear that safety would be snatched away the moment she let her guard down. He did not know what to say to that, was not a man given to easy words, but he took her hand, roughly calloused against her own scarred fingers, and simply stood with her in the silence, and that silence said more than any speech could have managed. It was not long after that when trouble found them, as Josiah had feared it eventually would. A pair of riders came up the mountain trail in early November, sent by the ringmaster who had not given up his search for his most valuable performer, and though Josiah had kept Lily's presence quiet, word traveled even in remote country, carried by trappers and traders who passed through occasionally for supplies, and eventually it had reached ears it should not have. The men who arrived at his cabin were not gentle, spoke to Josiah with the casual contempt of men used to buying their way past obstacles, offering money for the return of what they called circus property, growing uglier in tone when he refused to even acknowledge that she was there. Lily, hidden in the loft, listened to the exchange with her heart hammering, old fear rising in her throat thick enough to choke on, certain that this was the moment her fragile new life would collapse, that Josiah would either hand her over to avoid trouble or that trouble would find them regardless. But Josiah did neither. He stood in his own doorway, rifle held loose but ready, and told the men in a voice gone hard and cold that they were trespassing on his land, that whatever business they thought they had was finished, and that they would do well to ride back down the mountain before the weather turned against them, because he would not offer a second warning. There was a tense moment where violence seemed to hang in the air, thick as the wood smoke, but something in Josiah's stillness, the absolute certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything he cared about worth protecting, convinced the riders that the fight was not worth the cost. They left with threats of returning with more men, of involving the law, of claims about ownership and contracts that Lily knew to be twisted half-truths designed to frighten rather than inform. But they left nonetheless, and Josiah stood watching until they had disappeared entirely down the mountain trail before he finally let his shoulders drop, the tension bleeding out of him all at once. When he came back inside, Lily had climbed down from the loft, tears streaming down her face, and she asked him, voice trembling, Why he had risked everything for her, a stranger he had known only a matter of weeks, when it would have been so much simpler to let her go and avoid the danger she had brought to his door. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and then he told her that he had spent 11 years believing the mountains were the only thing that could not be taken from him, the only safety he had left, but that in the weeks since she had fallen into his life, he had realized that safety without anyone to share it with was just another kind of loneliness dressed up as peace, and that he would rather risk losing everything than go back to a silence he now understood had been its own kind of death. It was not a declaration of love, not in so many words, but it did not need to be, because the truth of it sat plain in his weathered face, and Lily crossed the small distance between them and wrapped her arms around him, careful of his ribs, careless of her own healing wounds, and for the first time since her parents had died she felt something that was not quite grief and was not quite fear but was instead something like homecoming. The ringmaster did send more men eventually, as promised, but by then the first heavy snows had closed the mountain passes, sealing Josiah's hollow off from the world below in a white silence that no rider could easily breach, buying them the winter to grow into whatever they were becoming without further threat of interruption. They spent those months learning each other fully, the small daily rhythms of shared life, her laughter filling corners of the cabin that had stood silent for over a decade, his patience steadying her in moments when old fears still surfaced unbidden, nightmares of the ringmaster's temper that woke her gasping in the dark until Josiah's low, steady voice and the solid warmth of his presence beside her reminded her she was somewhere safe now, somewhere no one could reach her without passing through him first. By the time spring finally broke the mountain free of its snow, something had settled between them that neither storm nor pursuit nor the passage of a hard winter could shake loose. And when the first passable trail opened down toward the valley towns, Josiah did not suggest she leave to seek a life elsewhere, and she did not ask to go. Instead, they rode down together that first warm week, not to return her to any life she had fled, but to see about proper legal protection against the ringmaster's claims, Josiah standing beside her in the territorial land office as she gave testimony that finally, formally, severed whatever false ownership had been claimed over her for so many years, and when the paperwork was signed and the matter closed for good, she wept not from grief this time but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of finally being unequivocally her own person, free to choose her own life for the first time since childhood. That summer, Josiah began work on an addition to the cabin, a second room that neither of them spoke about directly but that both of them understood the meaning of, and by the time the aspens turned gold again, marking a full year since the storm that had brought her stumbling and broken into his life, he asked her properly, on the same ridge where they had first stood together looking out over the valley, whether she would stay with him not as a guest sheltering from circumstance but as his wife, as a partner for whatever years the mountains chose to grant them. She said yes before the words had even fully left his mouth, and they were married that autumn in the small mountain town below, Josiah standing tall and uncomfortable in a borrowed coat, Lily radiant in a simple dress that bore no resemblance to the glittering costumes of her old life, surrounded by the handful of mountain folk who had come to know and respect the quiet giant and the fierce, graceful woman who had somehow tamed his solitude without diminishing his strength. They built a life together in that high hollow over the years that followed, raising children who grew up as comfortable in the wilderness as their father and as full of laughter and grace as their mother. And though Lily never returned to performing in any formal sense, she taught her children the old balancing tricks and acrobatic skills of her circus years as playful games, keeping that part of her history alive even as she left its cruelty behind for good. Josiah, for his part, found that the silence he had once guarded so fiercely had never truly been peace at all, only the absence of pain, and that the noise and warmth and unpredictable joy Lily had brought into his life was worth infinitely more than any solitude he had mistaken for safety. On quiet evenings, long after the children were asleep, they would sometimes sit together on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and orange the way it had that very first evening he found her broken and terrified in a ravine, and he would think, not for the first time, that the mountains had given him nothing in 11 years of solitude that came close to what they had given him the day the storm carried her screaming into his life. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt mountain love stories.